They fined her $1,500 without evidence. No hearing, no explanation. Just a judge and a number pulled from thin air. Jasmine Crockett walked into that courtroom expecting law. What she found was something far more dangerous. A man wearing a robe who thought his power was absolute. But what he did not expect was that his attempt to shut her down would become the moment she turned the entire courtroom upside down. Because Jasmine Crockett was not just there to defend herself. She was there to expose a system built on silence, and she was about to do it with nothing but the truth and her voice. If you want to hear the full truth, make sure to hit that subscribe button. It started like any routine hearing on a cold, gray morning in downtown Chicago. Courtroom 2A was scheduled for what should have been a simple check-in, a minor procedural appearance over an alleged violation. But from the moment Jasmine stepped inside, she felt the shift in the air. It was not just quiet. It was cold, calculated. The court staff barely made eye contact. The walls themselves felt like they were holding their breath. And at the center of it all sat Judge Richard Monroe, a man who had long ruled his courtroom like a king more than a servant of the law. He did not greet the room. He did not acknowledge the counsel tables. He just adjusted his robe and started speaking. His voice came low, sharp, and final. The defendant is in violation of Code 22F. The fine is $1,500. That is the court's decision. That was it. No hearing. No presentation of facts. Not even a procedural introduction. The ruling had been made before Jasmine had even opened her file. She was not just being fined, she was being silenced. Most people would have sat down. Most would have walked away. But Jasmine did not. She stood. Calm. Steady. Her hands folded. Her voice clear. Your Honor, with all respect, we have not even begun. I have not presented a single argument. Monroe's eyes narrowed, his irritation sharp enough to cut the air. Because none are needed, he snapped. You violated the code. It is not up for debate. His voice was not just dismissive. It was biting. Personal. This was not about a fine. It was about dominance. He was not judging her case. He was trying to make her an example. But Jasmine did not flinch. She had been here before, in courtrooms where power was used like a weapon. And she had learned that in those moments, control was not noise. It was restraint. She drew a breath, then said the one thing Monroe could not ignore. Due process requires that I be heard. Her words were not loud, but they landed with weight. She was not asking for permission. She was demanding what the law already promised. And in that moment, the temperature in the courtroom shifted. She had just taken control, and Judge Monroe knew it. Judge Monroe's face barely moved, but the tension in his jaw betrayed everything. Jasmine's request was not loud. It was not rebellious. It was legal, grounded, and undeniable. But that made it even more dangerous to him. Because this was not a woman making a scene. This was a lawyer reminding a judge that his authority had limits. And that kind of reminder, in Monroe's courtroom, was not just unwelcome. It was threatening. This is not your stage, he barked, his voice rising with the kind of anger that had nothing to do with law. This is my courtroom. I will not entertain speeches or stall tactics. It cracked through the room like a whip. But Jasmine stood steady. Every inch of her body radiated control. Her heart was pounding under her tailored blazer, but her eyes never wavered. Because this was no longer about a fine. This was about power, who held it, and who dared to question it. The prosecutor across the aisle shifted awkwardly. Even he looked caught off guard by the speed of Monroe's ruling and the sharpness of his tone. No one had presented a case. No evidence had been entered. This was not justice. This was performance. And Jasmine was not here to play along. She reached slowly into her folder, each movement deliberate, like she was disarming a trap. Then she said it, flat and sharp, cutting the silence like a scalpel. We proceed on the record. Monroe blinked. The clerk looked up. A quiet tension began to stretch across the room. Jasmine was not backing down. She was not making a scene. She was building a case, and she was doing it in real time, in front of everyone. She began calmly, methodically. Sullivan vs. State of Illinois, 2017, she said, holding up the first page. A fine was issued under code enforcement. No photographs. No documentation. The appeals court reversed the ruling, citing due process violations. She laid it flat on the table. Henderson vs. City of St. Petersburg, 2019. Again, no verifiable evidence. The court ruled fines must be based on fact, not assumption. Every case she cited was a direct challenge to Monroe's ruling. And with each citation, his posture tightened. He leaned forward on the bench, not to engage, but to defend. But Jasmine wasn't performing. She was exposing. Monroe had not ruled based on law. He had ruled based on ego. And now, that ego was under legal fire. You fined me $1,500, Jasmine said, her voice low but sharp. Without opening the hearing. Without a single piece of evidence. That is not enforcement. That is authoritarianism in judicial robes. A ripple passed through the gallery. The attorneys in the back exchanged glances. The air was changing. The silence was not passive anymore. It was watching, listening. Jasmine had taken the courtroom and reshaped it into what it was always meant to be, a place where power had to answer to reason. And for the first time, Monroe looked unsure. Monroe shifted in his chair, but he did not speak. His fingers tapped a slow, uneven rhythm against the bench. Every argument he had hurled so far had bounced back sharper. Jasmine was not defying the court. She was commanding it. Not with volume, but with the law itself. She did not need theatrics. She had precedent, clarity, and something far more dangerous to Monroe, truth spoken without fear. You can ignore my argument, she said softly, eyes locked on him. But you cannot erase precedent. And you will not rewrite the Constitution from behind that bench. The court reporter resumed typing, as if suddenly aware that history might be unfolding in real time. The prosecutor, who had earlier sat with detached indifference, was now leaning forward, his hands clasped tightly. Even the gallery seemed to stop breathing. Jasmine was not just holding her ground. She was building a fire under Monroe's authority, and everyone could feel the temperature rising. This court will recess for 15 minutes, Monroe suddenly declared, his voice strained, his words clipped. Then, without meeting anyone's eyes, he stood and turned toward the chamber door. No justification. No ruling. No gavel. It was not a break, it was an escape. The door shut behind him, and for the first time that morning, the courtroom truly exhaled. Not in relief, but in realization. He was rattled. The man who had entered the room with total control had just fled it, unable to hold the floor he once commanded with intimidation. Jasmine remained standing. Her hands rested calmly on the folder that had just dismantled the judge's entire authority. She was not triumphant. She was still. Focused. Measuring the room like a surgeon preparing for a second incision. There was no celebration. No nod. Only silence, charged with meaning. 15 minutes. That was the time Monroe asked for. But Jasmine knew better. This was not a recess. This was damage control. Somewhere behind that closed door, Monroe was calling someone, looking for a lifeline, an excuse, anything to shift the narrative. Because he understood now, he was no longer facing a defendant. He was facing accountability. When the door finally creaked open again, it was not just Monroe who returned. Another figure followed, a taller man, older, with a robe heavier than Monroe's and a walk that carried institutional weight. Judge Thomas Whitaker. His very presence sent a low hum through the gallery. No one had expected this. Whitaker was not summoned for routine hearings. He was federal. Senior. Respected. The kind of man brought in when things were spiraling fast. Monroe adjusted his robe and returned to his seat. His voice, once sharp and absolute, now came out flatter, forced. For the record, he began. "I have invited Judge Whittaker to observe and, if necessary, provide guidance on procedural matters." But everyone knew the truth. This was not guidance. It was cover. Monroe had lost control. And now, Jasmine Crockett was standing trial not just in front of a biased judge, but before the entire system. Judge Whittaker did not waste time. He settled into the co-bench like a man used to gravity, his expression unreadable, his presence unmistakable. He did not need to speak loudly. His silence alone carried judgment. And when his eyes landed on Jasmine, they did not challenge her, they examined her. Not with hostility, but with surgical precision. Posture. Cadence. Intent. He was not looking at a lawyer. He was measuring a storm. "Miss Crockett," he said, his voice even and commanding, "you have raised constitutional concerns. I would like you to restate your core argument, for the record." It was not a question. It was a test. A live one. And Jasmine understood that the stakes had just shifted. This was not about defending herself anymore. It was about defending truth beneath a microscope, under the gaze of a man who had seen it all. She stepped forward, not hesitating, not even glancing at her folder. "Yes, Your Honor. I will begin with the due process failure supported by appellate precedent." And in that moment, everything changed. She was no longer challenging Monroe. She was commanding the floor, invoking the law with the confidence of someone who had carved every page into memory. The courtroom quieted into a stillness so tight, even the lights seemed to dim. But the next wave was coming. "Call Officer Nathan Ellis to the stand," the bailiff announced. From the back of the room, a man rose. Officer Ellis walked with the kind of confidence that comes from years of never being questioned. His uniform was pristine. His face blank. He looked like a man who had already written the end of the story. He sat, raised his hand, took the oath, and folded his arms like this would be quick. Jasmine approached with measured steps. "Officer Ellis, you issued the citation that resulted in this fine, correct?" "Yes, ma'am," he said smoothly. "And that citation was based on a violation you observed personally?" "That's right." She nodded once. "Did you take photographs?" "No, ma'am." "Did you file a written incident report? Diagrams? Witness statements?" "No, ma'am." "None required." Her voice dropped just a fraction. "Was there anyone else present at the time?" "No. I was alone." She paused. Just for a second. Then turned slightly toward the bench. "So to clarify, this fine, totaling $1,500, was issued with no documentation, no third-party verification, and no supporting evidence. Just your personal judgment?" Ellis's answer was slower this time. "I've been doing this for 20 years. I know what a violation looks like." And there it was, the crack. Jasmine stepped closer, her tone steady but now laced with iron. "We are not here to debate instincts. We are here to examine evidence." The silence that followed was louder than any objection. Because in that moment, every person in that courtroom understood what had just happened. Officer Ellis had turned due process into a matter of opinion. And Jasmine Crockett had just peeled the truth into the open. Ellis shifted in his seat, the first visible sign that his confidence had begun to slip. It was not a dramatic movement, just a subtle tightening of the jaw, a slight glance toward Monroe, then toward Whittaker. But Jasmine saw it. She saw everything. And she pressed forward. "Do you believe that your personal opinion," she asked slowly, "without any supporting documentation, is enough to override the due process rights of a citizen in a federal court?" Ellis hesitated. "I believe my experience qualifies me to make field judgments." "Judgments?" Jasmine echoed, her voice cool and deliberate. "But we are not talking about your instincts. We are talking about legal penalties. Fines. Enforcement. The Constitution." She turned toward the bench. "Your Honors, what we are witnessing is not enforcement. It is assumption. This citation was not supported by law. It was built on interpretation and dressed as authority." Then she turned back to Ellis. Can you point to any item in the citation file, just one, that qualifies as verifiable evidence? He blinked once, then said quietly, "No, ma'am." The room stilled. Jasmine did not gloat. She let the silence speak. She faced the bench again, her voice sharp and direct. "Your Honors, this officer just admitted under oath that his entire enforcement action is based on subjective judgment. No photos, no timestamp, no report. And yet, a $1,500 penalty was imposed." Whitaker leaned forward slightly, his fingers forming a steeple, but he said nothing. He did not need to. The pressure in the room had shifted. "This is not about Officer Ellis as a person," Jasmine continued. "It is about the precedent. If we accept this standard, then every citizen becomes vulnerable to one man's memory. A bad mood, a rush day, a misinterpretation, and someone loses their rights, their money, maybe their future." The younger attorneys in the gallery now leaned in, their eyes wide. Even the prosecutor looked uncomfortable, his fingers fidgeting against his notes. Jasmine took one final step forward. "Officer Ellis, if this citation were to be challenged, like it is being challenged now, what would you offer this court in defense of your actions?" He looked between the judges and then at Jasmine. His voice had lost its edge. "I would say I acted within the scope of my training." "Noted," Jasmine said, her tone now as precise as a scalpel. "So we are left with this, a fine of $1,500, issued without evidence, grounded in personal belief." And then she dropped the line that split the room wide open. "What you are calling a citation, officer, is really just your opinion in uniform." The silence that followed was electric. Monroe stared down at his desk. Whitaker leaned back, stone still. The gallery exchanged looks of disbelief. Jasmine had not just won an argument. She had exposed a truth that no one could unsee. In that moment, the state's case collapsed, not with noise, but with the undeniable weight of logic. And Jasmine Crockett stood at the center of it, unshaken. Jasmine turned toward the bench, her voice now calm but carrying the weight of every injustice she had just laid bare. "Your Honors," she began, "we have discussed precedent, process, and law. But this is not just about paper. This is about people." She opened her folder and held up a page. "Daniel Rhee, Vietnam veteran. Lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He lost his business, then his home, all because the city auto-flagged a licensing checkbox he never knew existed. When he asked for help, he got a form letter. No hearing. No apology. Just a ruin left behind." She flipped the next page. "Karen Bautista. Electrician. Savannah, Georgia. Worked 15 years without a single safety violation. Then the licensing board quietly changed the rules. Told her she could not work anymore. No warning. No explanation. Her life's work vanished overnight." The courtroom had fallen into a breathless stillness. Jasmine paused and raised one final document. "James Weller. Retired trucker. Bought land outside Waco, Texas. Built a fence, 17 inches over an invisible property line. They fined him $10,000. He tore it down himself in the Texas heat. Then they fined him again. Why? Because some of the posts were still in the ground." She closed the folder. "These are not stories. These are people. People who were destroyed by the same unchecked authority that almost silenced me today." The room was silent. Even Monroe no longer pretended to take notes. Everyone was watching her now, not as a defendant, but as a voice they could not ignore. She looked directly at the judges. "I am not asking for mercy. I am demanding accountability. This fine was issued with no documentation, no testimony, no evidence. If this is allowed to stand, it tells every citizen that power does not need proof, that opinion alone is enough to punish." Whitaker finally moved. His voice came slow, deliberate, and final. "I have heard enough. Miss Crockett is correct. Judicial discretion does not override constitutional standards. This court cannot uphold a fine without substantive evidence." Monroe sat frozen. His hands clasped, his eyes low. Whitaker continued. This court finds that the penalty imposed under Municipal Code 22F lacks the evidentiary support required. The fine is vacated. The charge is dismissed. The gavel never came down. It did not need to. The ruling had been written in the silence, in the shift of power that Jasmine had forced into the room. She did not smile. She did not cheer. She simply stood still, letting the truth settle into every corner of the courtroom like sunlight after a storm. And then Monroe spoke, not with authority, but with a brittle whisper. I underestimated you. Jasmine met his eyes. You would not be the first. And with that, she turned and walked out, not just as someone who had won, but as someone who had changed what winning meant. Because Jasmine Crockett had not just beaten a fine. She had rewritten the rules.